All right, so we're going to start examining the respiratory and circulatory systems after we follow up nervous system. And these are two individual organ systems, but we teach them together because they are very interrelated and they connect on a lot of different levels that you're about to experience. All right, so the circulatory and respiratory systems, as I said, are very closely intertwined and they work together in maintaining, wait for it, homeostasis. So, part of homeostasis, as we've talked about in class a lot, is going to be the regulation of things such as body temperature, heart rate, breathing, oxygen, and CO2 levels. And those are going to be big components, the oxygen and CO2 levels, that you will see throughout this PowerPoint and moving forward whenever we really talk about blood. So, we're going to be doing a lot with blood in the next couple of days, including our heart dissection, and these will be big components in regards to that. So, the respiratory system's overall function or job is going to be to transport gases to and from the circulatory system. And these gases are specifically oxygen and CO2. Remember, oxygen is what we take in, and CO2 is what we actually exhale that we want to get out of our blood because it makes our blood really acidic. And like we talked about with homeostasis, anytime that we have a change in pH, it can be very detrimental to our body as a whole. So we want to bring more oxygen in and remove more CO2, and we do this through the respiratory system. The circulatory system actually is the system or organ system that moves this blood throughout our entire body. And so you can see how the two are very important in working together. The respiratory system will actually take the CO2 in and take the oxygen in and remove the CO2. And then the circulatory system is going to be responsible for moving that fresh oxygen throughout the body until all of the oxygen has essentially been used up. And then its job is to get the CO2 back out to our lungs so we can exhale it. Both systems work together. So remember, when we talk about body systems, we're talking about how multiple organs make up these systems. And so on the left, we have all of the individual organs that make up the respiratory system. So we have the nose, the mouth, the sinuses, the trachea, the lungs, and the diaphragm. And we'll touch about all those today. On the right, you can see the circulatory organs are going to be a lot simpler. It's going to be the heart, blood vessels. And part of those blood vessels are arteries, veins, and capillaries. So those are kind of the three big words you need to know as far as the actual transportation of blood. So this is a really nice image, and I have the same image kind of scattered throughout this PowerPoint just to kind of show you how all of these organs, which we just talked about, work together. So this is, let's say, Charlie. And Charlie has his nose, mouth. His epiglottis is actually this little flap back here, which helps him from choking on food, or rather prevents it from going down the wrong pipe. And what we mean by that is right here, we have the trachea, and just below the trachea is the esophagus. And so below, I mean underneath it. So the trachea actually lies on top of your esophagus. And the job of the epiglottis, which is actually part of the digestive system, which we'll talk about next week, is essentially to make sure that food and air are separated correctly and go into the right pipes. When we have air moving down our trachea, it then goes into our lungs, and our lungs are essentially a series of pipes or tubes, you could call them, that kind of branch out like a tree. So we have this really big one here, which is the bronchus. And remember, this whole thing is the lung. And the bronchus then breaks down into bronchioles, okay? And here's a zoomed in picture of a bronchiole. And then the bronchiole actually breaks down into alveoli, which are these little grape-like sacs. And the most important thing to remember from these alveoli is surface area. So remember, we talk a lot about surface area. More surface area you have, essentially, the faster things can diffuse in and out. And so this is really important when we're talking about getting oxygen in and getting CO2 out. The more surface area that our alveoli have, the faster this process can happen. So that's why it's super, super important that our lungs are composed the way they are. And then down here is your diaphragm. And if you've ever been in choir or you sing, your choir teacher might say, get a deep breath in the diaphragm. The diaphragm is essentially the lowest portion of the lungs, and it can hold a great deal of oxygen down there. But it is a muscle, and it does take work to get it to expand, to stretch out, and to be able to hold oxygen. And then as you can see, the ribs actually encase the lungs to protect them. So this is essentially the lung, and like I said, it's kind of a pathway or a series of openings and tubes. And so the job or the reason that we have all of these parts of our respiratory system is to go ahead and make sure that we're getting oxygen in and we're getting CO2 out. The job of the nose and the mouth is going to actually be to filter primarily the nose and to moisten or warm primarily the mouth, any kind of air coming in. And this is important because let's say you're standing outside and it's super, super cold. If you were bringing in air from outside into your lungs and that air wasn't being changed temperature wise, it could be a really big shock to your organs and it could possibly do some damage or maybe make you more prone to being ill. So it's really important that the mouth and the nose actually filter and warm up the air or the oxygen as it's coming in. Once we get into the trachea and the bronchus and the bronchioles, the job is to essentially, you have little parts of mucus that trap any kind of foreign particle or any kind of ickiness, germs, that kind of stuff. And then you have these little cilia, which if you remember are very much like the cilia on a cell or on bacteria. They're these little tiny fingers, remember, and their job is essentially to sweep or collect any kind of foreign material, which is in part what helps us cough when we have something kind of like we inhale too quickly, so maybe we inhaled some salt or some pepper and we were choking on it. That's essentially a mechanism that our body has developed over long, long periods of time of evolution to protect our delicate lungs and the structures within our lungs from being damaged. And so what's happened in an instance when you inhale maybe a bunch of dust or something and you start coughing or wheezing is the cilia have actually caught the particles that shouldn't be in your lungs and they're trying to push or sweep them back out. All right, so the respiratory system is really, really cool. And again, this all works to maintain homeostasis. So that's kind of our big underlying theme. All right, so I touched on this before. Respiratory system is a series of tubes or passageways, and we start up here with the trachea. Again, the trachea lays on top of the esophagus. So this is where you get air, and then underneath this is your esophagus. This is where you get food. Okay, so that's kind of important. This is the main passageway to the lungs, and then we go into these two giant bronchus. We call them bronchi, is plural, so you drop the US and add an I. And these are the big main branches off the trachea. And then they branch into lots of tiny little branches, very much like a tree, and we call these bronchioles. And then again, attached to these little bronchioles, like here, we have these alveoli, which again are lots and lots and lots, millions of little tiny grape-like air sacs. And again, they have huge surface area, which is super important for taking in fresh oxygen and exhaling that icky CO2, which isn't good for our body if we keep it in our body for too long. And this is where gas exchange actually happens, meaning this is where we actually are converting chemically the CO2 and the O2. All right, and here's a zoomed in picture one more time just to show you. These little guys are actually covered in mucus and they're wrapped in tiny blood vessels. And again, this helps to make sure that they have lots of healthy blood flow. And again, remember what's carried in the blood is going to be the oxygen and the CO2. So this is why gas exchange happens here, and this is how it happens here. And then this is, again, just a little illustration. This is the bronchus or the bronchi if we're talking about both. Then these are the little bronchioles that are going to be like little tree limbs that kind of come off. And then the alveoli, 300 to 600 million, and they just kind of scale all the way up, and they're going to increase surface area. So they're really, really important. So sometimes we have issues with respiratory system, and one of the greatest issues can be bronchitis and asthma. And asthma is something that a lot of people suffer from. It can be either an allergic response, so maybe you're allergic to pollen or ragweed, and then you have trouble breathing as a result of that. We'll talk about allergies in the spring a little bit. Or it can just be exercise-induced or stress-related, in which case what happens is your bronchi, those two big main tubes, so the bronchus, if we're talking about just one or the other, they start to narrow. And what happens is when they get narrow, think of it almost like traffic going down an expressway or even down Western Avenue. When you go from 2 lanes to 1 lane, what happens? Well, it gets really, really hard for traffic to keep moving forward. And so that's the same with oxygen. If the bronchi get small and narrow, it gets really, really hard for that oxygen to get through, and therefore you have a shortness of breath. Anytime that people have issues with asthma, the doctor usually prescribes a inhaler. And what the inhaler does is it essentially dilates or makes those bronchi reopen up so that air can get through more easily. And this obviously alleviates the issues of asthma. Bronchitis, which I ironically just had a week and a half ago, is very, very similar to asthma, only it's caused by a virus or bacterial infection. Essentially, you cough a lot when you have bronchitis. So remember, bronch means our lungs, and itis is an inflammation. So this word literally translates to inflammation of the lungs. And so what happens is you have a lot of coughing and a lot of mucus, and that's your body actually responding the way it should be, trying to get those icky bacteria or virus germs out. It's just not such a pleasant experience for us humans. And again, the doctor will prescribe maybe some cough medicine to kind of alleviate the pain of coughing so much. But again, we'll prescribe an inhaler. And again, the job of that inhaler is to open up those bronchi so that more air can get in. Okay, so that's our respiratory system. So now we're going to move into circulatory system, which is essentially blood and how blood moves throughout our body. The key component of our circulatory system is our heart. And so next week, we're actually going to dissect a cow heart. Get excited. All right, so the job of the circulatory system is pretty easy and pretty simple, straightforward. Its job is to bring oxygen into the body and carry it to all the cells that need it, and then to pick up all of the CO2 that's already been depleted of the oxygen, so it's actually been changed from oxygen to CO2, to pick that up, to carry it away from the cells, back to the lungs, where we can exhale it and get it out of our body. Another job of the circulatory system is to deliver nutrients through the body. This is after everything is absorbed through the small intestine, and we'll talk about that when we do the digestive system coming up. And then to carry waste away from cells. So not only are we talking about CO2, but we can talk about water. So water can be wasteful depending on the cell we're talking about. We can be talking about salt, and we can be talking about urea, which is actually a really concentrated form of urine that controls or contains a lot of nitrogen. And then last but not least, it helps in fighting infections, and the big one is temperature regulation. So our circulatory system is really, really important in maintaining temperature as a part of homeostasis. All right, so the circulatory system is a little more straightforward as far as organs go. That's because there's three big ones. So the first big one is the heart, right? It's a big, giant muscle. It's very special. It's the only muscle in your body made out of cardiac tissue, all right? So you have three types of muscle. You have smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle. And your heart is the only organ in your whole body made of cardiac muscle. And it's kind of amazing because that muscle works until the day you die. And so if you get to live to be 102, which I know we all will, myself included, obviously, that muscle, that cardiac muscle, is going to beat every single day, millions of times a day, until we all move on to greener pastures in 102 years. So it's a really, really amazing muscle when you think about how busy it is and how active it is and how many jobs it has and how good it is at doing those jobs, right? So that's our heart. Heart's the big one. The next one is our blood. And our blood, you might just go, oh, it's blood, but it's actually very complex. And so it contains a lot of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. It can also contain kind of fat depending on your diet. It can also carry oxygen and CO2 on those blood cells. So the blood itself is actually really, really important and contains a lot of things that I think we maybe sometimes overlook. And so we'll go into that a little bit when we do genetics. We'll actually talk about blood typing and all the different components of blood. But blood is part of the circulatory system. And then last but not least are blood vessels, and their job is essentially to carry blood to all the body cells and then to actually bring blood away from those body cells once they've dropped off the oxygen, and then they are basically bringing the CO2 back to the lungs to be expelled. So of our blood cells, there's three types. There are arteries, which carry blood away from the heart. So I want you to see arteries away. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. This is oxygenated blood, so it's nice and red. It's got a lot of great oxygen because the heart and the lungs are right next to each other. We're going to go into that in a second. So the arteries are oxygenated and carry blood away. The veins are going to be blue because they've actually lost that oxygen. They are now full of CO2, and they're going to carry blood back to the heart, where it's going to then take that CO2 concentrated blood and give it back to the lungs, where we as humans will expel that air, or that CO2 heavy, dense air, and then bring in new fresh air. And we're doing it right now, and you're not even thinking about it. Isn't that amazing? And the last but not least are your capillaries. And your capillaries are tiny, tiny little blood vessels, and they deliver oxygen and remove CO2 all on their own. And the best example I can give you of your capillaries is if you look in your eyeballs. So if you go in front of a mirror or you look at your partner and you look and you make them make their eyes really big and you look in their eyes, those are capillaries. And we have capillaries everywhere in your body. It's just that that's the easiest place to see them. All right, so we're going to go a little bit more into each of these, than I've covered this already, but it doesn't hurt to go over it again. So first is arteries. All right, so remember, arteries carry blood away, AA. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. This blood is oxygenated, so it's full of nice, rich oxygen red blood cells. It's very thick, muscular, and it has flexible walls, okay? So arteries are actually thicker than veins. There's a fun fact for you. And there are no valves in arteries. And if you don't know what I mean by that, you will in just a second. So this is essentially a picture of an artery. It's red because in all science textbooks, we color arteries red to represent that they are fully oxygenated and they're carrying oxygen. So that's kind of just a helpful hint. If you're ever looking at an anatomy textbook or even this PowerPoint slide, wherever you see red, think arteries. And then this just kind of shows you where I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but this is essentially an artery and how it connects into these little capillaries, okay? So this is what a capillary looks like. They're almost like a really fine web of little tiny skinny arteries and veins, because they do both, that can kind of get closer to the skin. So we'll get into that in a second. But so the big takeaways from arteries are arteries carry blood away from the heart. It is oxygenated blood, and they are very thick and flexible, and they do not have valves. So those are the big things to know about arteries. Okay. Capillaries is going to be kind of our transition between arteries and veins. Capillaries, again, are going to be super skinny, tiny little guys. They are essentially a mix, if you will, between the types of textures of arteries and veins, because they do both jobs. And their job is basically to cause a web or a connection between arteries and veins, right? So this is a vein, this is an artery. Remember what I said, arteries are red, veins are blue. And then these are the tiny little capillaries that weave in between. All right, so their job is to connect larger highways, if you will, because at the end of the day, our veins and our arteries are very similar to major roads or major highways. So you can almost think of like this is Western, and this is Damon, and this is Grace and Roscoe and Oakley and all those smaller roads that connect the two. If you're not familiar with this neighborhood, I'm sorry, go outside and walk around. It'll help. My analogies will help, I promise. And then last but not least, the blood will actually travel through these in a very straight and singular line. So they're kind of web-like, but at the end of the day, they are more or less straight. And we kind of use that term relatively because obviously veins and arteries aren't exactly straight either, but at the end of the day, they're as straight as our body will let them be. All right, and last but not least, veins. So veins are usually blue. They are full of deoxygenated blood, meaning the blood has already dropped off oxygen at all the cells in our body, and it's now returning to the heart and the lungs to get more oxygen. All right, since it's deoxygenated, that means it has a higher concentration of CO2, so carbon dioxide. So for example, on your assessment, if I ever asked you, would veins or arteries have a higher concentration of CO2, you would say veins. And I said, which would have a higher concentration of oxygen? You would say arteries. Veins have very thin walls, all right? So that's kind of interesting. And they have valves. And so the job of these valves is to reduce blood flowing in the opposite direction. All right, now this is kind of fun and somewhat applicable maybe. If you know what a varicose vein is, and if you don't, look it up. I actually had them. They are veins that have very weak walls, which, hello, thin walls, okay? So veins are thin to begin with. And so what happens in varicose veins is the blood actually gets trapped behind these valves. And so it basically starts to try and flow backwards. And what happens is the blood actually pools and it forces the vein over time, in older people generally, because it's kind of, they've experienced this their whole life. It forces the vein to actually pop out of the skin. Whoops, I got excited. All right, so I can show you mine scars sometime. It's not even a scar. It's just remnants at this point. But so essentially that's what a varicose vein is. And so veins, if you remember, in textbooks are blue. They're full of deoxygenated blood and they're headed back to the heart, right? So they're going back to the heart. They're very thin in comparison to arteries, and they have valves which try to reduce blood flow. And when those valves are weak or broken, if you will, for lack of a better term, that's how people get varicose veins. So again, if you don't know what a varicose vein is, go ahead and look it up, Google it. It can be kind of unsightly. It's not necessarily bad for your health, but they can make your body really achy. So like when I had one, and I'll tell you why I'm using past tense in a minute. when I had one in my leg, I would go for a really long run and my legs would ache, like almost like cramping. And it was because the blood was trapped. And so I used past tense because they can actually remove varicose veins and it's very unpleasant and I would not recommend it for anyone and I would never do it again. But if you would ever like to hear that story, let me know. All right, so now into the main course of our circulatory system, the heart. So like I said earlier, the heart is made of really special muscle called cardiac muscle. It's the only part in our whole body made out of cardiac muscle. And the cardiac muscle is really special because it doesn't ever get tired, okay? So again, I talked about how we had smooth muscle and skeletal muscle in our body. Your skeletal muscle, for example, is like your quad and your hamstring and your calves, right? So think about the worst workout you ever had and you felt like you were about to fall over and this is it. And, God's going to come down from the heavens and swoop you up because, oh my gosh, you're going to die, right? It happens. Your thighs get sore, your hamstrings get sore, maybe your biceps get sore from lifting weights. Well, guess what never gets sore? Guess what never tires out? Your heart, right? So when you think about it like that, it's really kind of amazing. And as I said earlier, your heart will pump until the day that you are no longer on this earth. And so for some of us, for the lucky ones, that'll be in a really, really, really long time. And so it's just amazing that this magical organ with this special tissue, right, cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, never gets tired. And it keeps on pumping and keeps on working forever and ever and ever. So it's really, really special. So of the heart, we have 4 chambers. We have 2 small chambers on the top, and we call them atrium or atria, depending on whether we're talking singular or double. And then underneath the atria are going to be our ventricles, and we have 2 of those. There are valves separating each, so again, preventing backflow of blood, because that could be really detrimental. So this is the first of many pictures you're going to see of the heart. And I'm just going to go through some really basic vocab with you. And again, we're going to label this guy and we're going to color it a million times. And when we dissect our cow hearts, you're going to go ahead and cut some of this stuff open. All right, this is the vena cava. The vena cava is a vein. This is the pulmonary and artery. And this is the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary, remember, means lung. So pulmonary artery and veins are actually attached to the lungs. You can see this would be your right lung and this would be your left lung. This is the front of the heart right here. This is going to be your atrias up here, 1 and 2. And these are going to be your ventricles, 1 and 2. And then these are essentially the valves that prevent backflow. So if I have blood and I have this valve going this way, as I hope you can guess, the blood's going to flow this way and then this way. So we're going with the grain of salt, with the valve, not against. It would be very, very unlikely and very dangerous if the blood moved in this direction. So we want to make sure we're going this way, right? And then this is our aorta, which actually moves up into the rest of our body. Okay. So let me just make sure. Okay, I want to make sure I didn't skip one. So our heartbeat. Heartbeat's really, really amazing. It's actually 2 contractions. If you've ever seen the movie The Santa Claus, there's a part where he goes to the doctor with Tim Allen, right? He goes to the doctor and the guy's listening to his heart and it's like bump, 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 right? And it does a Christmas song or something. But that bump, bump, that's actually 2 contractions. And essentially what's happening is the atria are contracting and then the ventricles are contracting. So it's really, really cool when you think about it. All right, so what happens when you're actually getting your heartbeat or when it's causing, when it's happening to you, I don't know what I'm trying to say, is your sinoatrial node. So we call it the SA node for short. It's right here. It actually has an electrical signal, which is sent down from your brain, and it causes these 2 guys to contract. So it's almost like if you've watched a hospital show and they put those paddles on somebody and they send an electrical shock, that's what they're doing. They're doing a man-made version of what your body does every second of every day without you thinking about it, all right? So they basically, your body electrically shocks these 2 guys, and these 2 guys contract, okay? And then what happens is this electrical signal actually moves from here to here, and this causes these 2 guys to contract. And so it's like this is the bum, and this is the bum. So it's bump, 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 right? And that's your heartbeat. And as they're contracting, they're actually pushing and moving blood from one to the next, from one to the next, from one to the next. Okay, so that's your heartbeat. And then this is going to be the blood flow. And yes, you will need to know this. We'll have a nice big exam before Christmas break. Lucky you. So let's go through it really quickly. And like I said, we'll go through it a bunch more times as we get through class. So we're going to start with the vena cava superior. Superior just means up. Inferior means down. So this is essentially someone's head, right? This is the very front of their chest. These are their legs down here. So we're going to start with blood going down this way. All right, so the blood is traveling through our superior vena cava, and it's going to come right into here. So now we are into the right atrium, okay? And it's going to follow those lovely, these are our valves, okay? It's going to go from the right atrium into the right ventricle. All right, now we're in the right ventricle. The blood is going to essentially be pushed through that heartbeat contraction, right? So that's how all this blood is moving. Your heartbeat contraction is moving this. So the blood is going to be pushed through the right ventricle up here into the pulmonary artery, and then it's going to travel into your lungs here and here respectively. So this artery actually kind of travels underneath the aorta, and you'll see this when you do your dissection. So when it goes into the artery, it's actually going to pick up fresh oxygen and get rid of any icky CO2. All right, and then what's going to happen is this blood is now going to come, so let's pretend this is the lung, is now going to come back through the pulmonary vein, down into the left atrium, and then down into the left ventricle. Remember, the heartbeat is moving this, so it's like bump, 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 bump. And then from here, the heart is going to squeeze that blood up into the aorta and back out through your body. And this is freshly oxygenated blood, okay? So if we were gonna, this isn't color-coded appropriately, but if we were gonna do it, we would essentially have oxygen depleted, oxygen depleted, oxygen depleted, oxygen depleted, oxygen depleted, okay? Filled with new yummy oxygen from our lungs, oxygen rich, oxygen rich, oxygen rich, oxygen rich. And then this would all go through our blood into our body. Okay. So there's two main circuits. We have a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. So the pulmonary, it's just the lungs, right? So it's the idea that blood goes from our heart to our lungs, gets oxygen, gets rid of CO2. The end. Systemic circuit's a little more difficult. The blood is actually pumped out of our heart through our aorta, and it goes to the rest of the body. The lub-a-dub, so the dun-dun, dun-dun, is actually the valves opening and closing and squeezing that blood in and out. And then this blood actually travels through our whole body. Arteries take it to all of the little last crevices, and then veins bring it back without the oxygen, and then back into the lungs to be quickly reoxygenated. All right. Arteries are red, veins are blue, capillaries connect the two. Oh, I just made a rhyme. Veins have valves and are thin. Arteries do not have valves and are thicker. Okay, those are some nice key terms of comparison. If, I decided to ask you to compare veins and arteries and give me 3 comparison points, those would be 3 right there. Okay, and the function or the job of the blood is, again, to deliver oxygen, to deliver nutrients, to pick up CO2, and then bring it back to the lungs so we can get rid of it. And then to get rid of or deliver, it depends, I guess, on what process we're talking about. But salt water, urea, which is that nitrogenous waste from the kidneys, to either remove that or to recirculate the water if we're dehydrated, functions and jobs like that. And last but not least, the job of homeostasis. So again, this whole thing has to do with homeostasis. So remember, in cold environments, our blood vessels are actually going to constrict. So they're going to get smaller, like this guy. And the reason they do that is to try and preserve the heat by moving those veins and arteries and capillaries, for that matter, away from the skin, where your skin would be more likely to let off heat, to try and keep your body, your major organs, and your brain warm. And then in a hot environment, your blood vessels and arteries are essentially going to dilate and get bigger so that they can release extra heat, which is in part why we sweat. And then this is our very last slide. Homeostasis. All right, so one of the main jobs of the circulatory and respiratory systems is going to be maintaining oxygen levels and making sure that CO2 levels don't get too high, because they can make our blood very acidic. So when cells need more oxygen, they send a message to our brain that we need more oxygen, and the brain basically communicates, discusses, sends messages with the respiratory and circulatory systems to actually increase oxygen flow to maintain homeostasis. And this is why maybe if you ever have trouble breathing, you actually start breathing more quickly because you're trying to get more oxygen into your body. So I hope you enjoyed this little mini lesson. I really, really love the respiratory and circulatory systems. I think they're really important, and I'm really looking forward to doing our Heart Day section. I know you guys are going to love it. So fill out the notes. I hope you did as we went through, and then you are going to have a worksheet where you're going to label the different parts of the respiratory system and give a function and a name to each. So feel free to use the textbooks in the cabinet or to use this PowerPoint again. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.